April 15, 2002 was one of the most deadly incidents to involve South Korea. While en route to its destination airport, Air China Flight 129 collided with the side of a mountain. Subsequently, investigators endeavored to determine the reason. April 15, 2002, a Boeing 767-200ER, which is one of the earliest models of the type, was engaged in a voyage from Beijing to Gimhe, South Korea. This was a brief voyage for the 767, particularly the extended range models, lasting only a few hours. On that day, the aircraft was at capacity with 166 passengers and crew members. They were anticipated to reach at Busan Gimhe Airport in the late morning at approximately 11:20. On this occasion, the flight deck was staffed by 3 individuals, despite the fact that the 767 only required 2 pilots to operate. Upon initial inspection, it would seem that the flight crew was exceedingly youthful. Captain Wu Xinlu, who was 30 years old at the time, was employed by Air China immediately upon graduating from flight school in 1994. He was promoted to captain just a few months prior to the disaster, and he had accumulated just under 6,500 flight hours. He is required to have a specific level of proficiency in English in order to serve as a commander at Air China. Captain Wu was not intended to be on the mishap flight that day. In order to accommodate an English examination, his schedule was adjusted. The aircraft on Flight 129 was actually piloted by First Officer Go Lige, who was 29 years old. He had been appointed to the first officer's position at Air China earlier that year and had accumulated just over 5,000 flight hours of experience. Hao Xiangning, a 27-year-old officer, was also wearing a jumpsuit. He was the least experienced member of the crew, with under 2,000 hours of log time, and this was his first time flying this route as an officer in the jumpsuit. He was responsible for the radio communications on Flight 129. The pilots of Flight 129 anticipated touchdown on runway 36 liters at Gimhe Airport from the south. Nevertheless, there was a modification to the strategy during the approach. The weather in this region of South Korea is frequently unpredictable. The direction of the weather may fluctuate abruptly. In reality, 8 flights that were scheduled to depart prior to Flight 129 were diverted to alternative airports as a result of inclement weather. The flight crew was never informed of this truth by the airport. Subsequently, the Korean controllers would be criticized by Chinese aviation authorities for their failure to provide precise communication regarding the weather report that day. The wind direction had changed, the visibility was poor, and it was overcast. That is why Flight 129 will now land on the opposite end of the runway. Runway 18R, however, this method was not as straightforward as flying directly from the north. The region surrounding the airport is characterized by a high degree of mountainous terrain. Despite the fact that both extremities of the runway are accessible, there is only one entry point, which is from the south. Consequently, the approach controller issued Flight 129 a circle-to-land instruction. This is precisely what it claims to be. The aircraft approached the airport from the south, as they would have done in the past. The aircraft would be manually maneuvered around the airport to land from the north in order to capitalize on the new wind conditions. Although it may seem somewhat unconventional, it is a relatively prevalent practice and is entirely safe. It was a standard procedure for Gimhe Airport due to its distinctive location. Nearly all of the subsequent events were not in accordance with standard protocol. I have been optimistic about the safety of this approach. However, my testimony is solely based on my personal experience. I have experience flying aircraft and have conducted theoretical approaches similar to this one. However, it is important to note that circling approaches are reported to be up to 25 times less secure than their straight-in counterparts, as per a document published by the European Advisory Committee. The document specifically references this accident, but it also asserts that the danger of circling approaches is reduced by the installation of guidance systems at the airport. Circling guidance lights were present on the approach path of Gimhe Airport at that time. However, we will discuss the airport illumination in greater detail shortly. Therefore, let us proceed to the methodology employed by Air China 129. To begin, let us examine the intended functionality of the circle-to-land approach. Initially, as anticipated, there is a substantial visual component to this. This method. The airport was still visible, as the runway lights remained illuminated throughout the foggy day, despite the less than ideal conditions. However, the Chinese authorities once more refuted this remark concerning runway lighting. Captain Wu, who survived the accident, later stated that he did not observe any such lights on the downwind segment, despite the fact that a controller in the tower later testified that the runway and circling approach lights for runway 18R were on. It was disclosed that the runway illumination was automated in order to reduce expenses. On the day of the accident, the timer was operating at a rate of roughly 20 minutes per minute. Therefore, there are those who contend that the lights were turned off during the disaster's unfolding. However, it is imperative that at least one pilot in this instance should have maintained visibility of the airport. An approaching aircraft would descend on the glide slope to 700 feet while maintaining awareness of the ILS for runway 36 liters. The circle to land can continue if the runway is visually identified. The aircraft that is approaching would deviate from the flight path at a roughly 45-degree angle to the west of the airport. A set of instructions for altitude, heading, and airspeed was detailed in the airport charts. Pilots could theoretically more accurately follow the flight path by timing the various segments of this circuit pattern in accordance with these guidelines and the plane's own chronometer or timer. The initial 45-degree segment, which we shall refer to as the breaking off segment, was to be maintained until the aircraft was aligned with the runway's base. The aircraft would enter the downwind leg upon reaching this point. The pilots would observe the aircraft pass the runway's terminus as it flew parallel to it. They would execute the base leg turn and align with the runway for the final, approximately 20 seconds later. In the instance of Gimhe Airport and Air China 129, the pilots would employ the chronometer to measure the time from the point of perpendicularity to the runway's terminus, and that would be the approximate point at which they were anticipated to pivot. Every pilot is capable of accomplishing this task. This is, in essence, the plane that connects the circuit. There are countless hours of circuit flight that every pilot has completed during their training, which dates back to flying school. Initially, Captain Wu Xinlu was the sole survivor of the flight crew. He, like any pilot, had completed a significant portion of this training. Nevertheless, he had never executed it at Gimhe Airport. It is hypothesized that the pilot's burden was significantly increased as a result of the late alteration to the flight plan, which involved the substitution of the runway. One of the most significant optical errors on the flight deck of Flight 129 was that the commander failed to provide the other pilots with a briefing on the new approach. The aircraft's automation was reactivated by the initial officer. In the forthcoming moments, he would be the pilot of the aircraft. The initial turn was executed at a shallow bank rather than the smooth 45-degree break from the 3 to 6 left approach path, which neither of the two other pilots observed. Additionally, Flight 129 was operating at an excessive rate of speed, which is a critical factor in this incident. The 767 would fly the downwind leg much closer to the airport than is typical due to the fact that the point at which the plane required to enter the downwind leg came much sooner due to excessive airspeed. The downwind was also flown at a significantly faster pace than anticipated. Amidst the pilot's overwhelming burden, all of this was accomplished. Thus, in fact, they were so preoccupied that they neglected to respond to numerous air traffic control calls. The plane was continually summoned by the approach controller to be transferred to the airport tower controller. These messages were not answered. The Air China flight crew did not respond until the controller radioed them on the standby emergency frequency. The 20-second timer was initiated as the aircraft reached the point perpendicular to the end of the runway, while the first officer continued to operate the flight controls while the plane was on the downwind leg. However, the runway's visibility would now be obscured by the weather. The pilot's ability to observe the outside world was restricted by cloud and smog. Nevertheless, the situation was about to worsen. Go Lai-jae, the first officer, was experiencing difficulty operating the aircraft amid deteriorating weather conditions. He ceded control of the aircraft to Captain Wu. As a result of this modification in flight deck responsibilities, the flight commander should assign duties to other crew members. This was not completed, and as a result, there was no indication of who should be responsible for which task. As a result, the airport was rendered invisible, and the pilots were unable to monitor their timetable. Captain Wu Xianlu observed that they were anticipated to execute the base turn for final, which is a 180-degree turn to align with the runway, after having flown past the end of the runway but still remaining somewhat parallel on the downwind leg. The tower controller issued the landing clearance to Flight 129 prior to his ability to make the turn. However, Captain Wu waited until he heard the transmission in the fall before making the turn. The aircraft now entered the disaster zone as they had surpassed their anticipated turning point. The captain may have realized that he could not safely execute a tight enough turn to align with the runway after observing that they were too close to the airport on downwind, according to one source. Consequently, he made a subtle left turn in an attempt to execute a wider turn that was easier to execute. The initial officer suggested that a go-around be implemented. The aircraft was approximately 3 kilometers north of its intended location when the captain eventually made the right turn. The aircraft descended significantly below the minimum altitude requirement, indicating that the pilot was unable to maintain it. The fact that they had recently entered the mountainous region just north of Gimhe Airport was obscured by the weather. In anticipation of the airport's arrival, Flight 129 deviated toward the mountains. We should take a brief break at this point. The technology that exists to alert pilots of terrain obstacles, such as hills or mountains, is referred to as the Ground Proximity Warning System, GPS in brief. This apparatus was installed by default on the Boeing 767. However, the GPS technology that was in existence at the time of the plane's initial development had certain constraints. Due to the fact that Air China Flight 129 was an older 200 model of the 767, it was equipped with an older iteration of the system. As far as the aircraft was concerned, this satisfied the criteria for the internal computer to recognize that this was a landing, as it was configured for landing with the landing gear down, flaps extended, nose raised, and stability. Consequently, the pilots were not notified. No notification was issued to the pilots of Flight 129 that they were approaching the mountains at an unsafe altitude. In an unexpected reversal of events, the mountains were visible. As anticipated, an effort was made to rescue the aircraft. However, it was too late. The aircraft was obliterated as it crashed into the mountainside, and the right wing was severed by the tops of the trees. The captain, as previously mentioned, did indeed survive the accident. He was exceedingly fortunate. The flight attendants, who were situated near the front of the aircraft, were among the other crew members who perished. A total of 129 individuals aboard the aircraft were fatally injured. 37 individuals did indeed survive. The majority of the survivors were situated in the rear of the aircraft, although a few were situated in the center. One of the most catastrophic air calamities to have occurred in South Korea was Air China Flight 129. Korean investigators discovered that the calamity was caused by a lack of crew resource management training and poor cockpit communication. It would seem that the pilots were unaware of the minimum operational conditions for their aircraft in inclement weather. Based on the investigation, the pilots should have either attempted a missed approach to attempt it again or diverted. The Korean investigation's findings identified numerous failings and deficiencies at the Gimhe Airport, including the absence of weather information from the airport in advance and issues with the airport's lighting and radar. Air China pilots were advised to undergo enhanced crew training in the future. The sole fatal accident that has occurred with Air China as of January 2023 was Flight 129. In 2012, the 767 was retired from service by the airline. Nevertheless, the Boeing 767 has maintained its success, as previously indicated in this video. Although the aircraft is being phased out of passenger service, it continues to operate effectively in the freight sector. It would seem that the Boeing 767 has a significant amount of remaining life. Thank you all for tuning in. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss out on our future content. Until next time, stay curious, stay creative, and keep exploring.